Hey everyone, Jimmy here, or Gaznat of Nilrak if you only know my screen name, and I'm here to give my 5 cents on the current state of the video game industry regarding a particularly ongoing gaming controversy. A particular one? Blech. An opinion piece like this has been a few months coming if I'm being honest, originally meant after this year's E3, where a Ubisoft game of all things seemed to have the most heart put into its presentation. Figures it to be attached to a collaboration with Nintendo, but that's neither here nor there right now. This has a strong possibility to come off as overly optimistic or as an out-of-touch Nintendo fan, but amidst all this madness recently, I felt a certain perspective I hadn't heard much might mean something to a few whose voices haven't been heard over the loud commotion recently. Considering I only have 14 subscribers at the time of recording this, I don't really expect to change the internet's opinion with this video. There's a chance, though, that this opinion piece might reach out to a similar audience, or someone with tastes similar to mine, so stick around for a few minutes if you like a more cautiously optimistic take of the current video game climate. I put aside a few reviews to get this video out, so let's just dive right into this one. If you paid any attention to pretty much any video game related news in the past week leading up to November 17th, 2017, then you're likely aware this video was inspired by the absolute hurricane that is the PR nightmare leading into Star Wars EA Battlefront 2. It's hard to classify the nature of a situation that is continuing to develop even as I wrote this a day before publishing this, but even as this video goes up on the official release date itself, the game has been dogged by a roller coaster of emotion, stretching all the way back to the beginning of the year. So let's backtrack a bit. When EA Battlefront was coming out in 2015, I was stoked. As a huge Star Wars fan, I was ecstatic that one of my favorite franchises in any medium was coming back for the fabled sequel trilogy that holiday season. Besides Episode 7, I had a new Battlefront to play as well. Well, color me hyped beyond the Outer Rim. This was going to be awesome. The hype was even more real as the world in general was gearing up to make Star Wars a massive event again after Episode 3 seemingly ended the film franchise. I loved the Clone Wars TV series, and was sad when it was cancelled during the acquisition by Disney, and when the canon was going to be restructured to finally have it make sense. I get it was a double-edged sword, because we were finally going to have a Star Wars timeline where everything mattered, and was canon, but at the short-term expense of leaving a lot of the expanded universe content in question. Falling under the Legends brand, a few elements have since made it back into the canon, albeit in, different fashions given the timeline, and having a Battlefront game that was unambiguously canon was exciting to me. Sadly though, the game arrived before Episode 7 and wasn't nearly as full-featured as my previous favorite, Battlefront 2 on the PlayStation 2. I do chalk this up to a bad habit of the gaming industry that kinda continues to this day, where many developers went all in on graphics, mostly over gameplay, around the mid-2000s. I know not all developers acted this way, because we have gotten a lot of good games since 2005 after all. I'm not completely jaded to be that pessimistic really. However, the pursuit of the highest quality graphics often comes at the expense of gamers and the games themselves. The jump to HD on consoles was a rough one, felt by virtually every developer in some way. For me, the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 weren't worth it for quite a bit. I've never really been a big Xbox guy in general, but the PS3 did eventually get me when Metal Gear Solid 4 came out in 2008, and eventually I enjoyed the library after that, but it did take 2 years until I got interested enough to get my first HD system. Now, jump to the generation we may or not be in now, it's kind of vague. When the PS4 and Xbox One arrived in 2013, their biggest draw to me was their true high-definition graphics. But even then, I still didn't get a PS4 until 2015, almost another 2 years later when Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain was approaching. And also so that I could grab Final Fantasy Type 0 HD and the Final Fantasy 15 demo it came with. Point is, while I appreciate insane graphics from a visual perspective, I value art style more in the long run, and it also helps that it ages you better, and, I kinda like to focus on gameplay first. Now, I'm more of an old-school mindset when it comes to most games, as I did grow up on Nintendo consoles mostly, and still tend to enjoy their systems for longer periods of time. This is mainly because they never forgot that they were making games consoles first. They were mocked when the Wii came out, back in 2006, and then they were laughing all the way to the bank years later because its novelty was a big enough draw that being underpowered compared to the PS360 duo wasn't as important back then. It did become noticeable by 2011 that HDTVs had become standard, and Wii games began to really show their limitations graphically, but it had enough games on it that I never regretted my time on it. My PS3 also got a lot of love in the back end of that 7th generation, as the Wii library kinda waned a bit, but I had both consoles for most any game I was interested in. Now flash forward to now. We're still dealing with issues that are kind of hindering a more pure type of game, but it's mainly been from changing business practices. Now, I'd like to say right now that I'm not against all these cinematic type of games. I can appreciate different games and their intentions if I feel they hit the mark on what they were aiming for more than what they missed, really. I wouldn't enjoy Metal Gear as much as I do if I didn't, and I enjoy the madness of games like Kingdom Hearts and Final Fantasy. Heck, you can pretty much chalk up any Square Enix title into that pile, since their stories can be just bonkers. But I'm kind of a sucker for those sort of things. But I never really left like Nintendo's stable, because they have the types of games I tend to enjoy. Most of them focus on gameplay first, and they have a mix of series that they sometimes iterate with, like Pokemon, and polish to a mirror sheen because of it, and other series where they change it up so much you might as well call it a spiritual successor or an experiment than a sequel, kind of like the Kirby series, and some other things like Kid Icarus when they bring something back from the vaults. And this brings us back to EA Battlefront. When they got the Star Wars license, I was so excited to have a bigger, better game than the PS2 originals, but what we got was a half-finished product, and I never really got the game because of it. The presentation was no doubt amazing, and as a drawer myself, I loved the art direction, how it truly felt like the closest thing to playing one of the films, but the gameplay experience just wasn't there. I did play a bit of a friend's copy, and it felt alright, but I don't have a PlayStation Plus for multiplayer, and thus I didn't have a reason to jump in. I still don't have one, really. I just got the Final Fantasy 15 like multiplayer comrade thing, and it's part of the season pass, so it was free. And even then, there's a single-player mode there, so I don't think I'm missing much, even though I have like a friend that wants to play, but I don't see a reason. Add to that the various editions of Battlefront was kind of shipping with, and all the DLC and a season pass that basically doubled the price of the game, and I just mentally checked out. I was disappointed that I didn't have the excitement I had when the prequel trilogy was in full swing, because in 2002, after I saw Episode 2, easily the worst Star Wars film, by the way, that's a video for another time, I had to finally get the sequel to a game I adored on my N64 that we had rented from Blockbuster years earlier. And yes, that really does age me. Rogue Squadron 2 was the PS2, GameCube, Xbox era wow moment for me as a kid. I had seen the screenshots in Nintendo Power and thought, that looks just like the movie. I had seen the kiosks and felt jealous, but I had asked for other games that Christmas for my GameCube. So when I finally popped in a Rogue Leader into my purple lunchbox in summer of 2002, I was completely floored. Most of that summer was spent trying to get gold medals and falling in love with Star Wars all over again, having seen the special edition of the original trilogy on VHS up with my grandparents. So playing the Death Star trench run with that level of graphics, sounds, and a score ripped straight from Episode 4, and having it all in such a technologically advanced package and presentation, I really miss Factor 5. They were technical wizards, and I really miss their expertise. EA Battlefront was not that game for me, though. It looked great barring a few voice acting misses for me, but it wasn't a complete game. This week, most of the gaming world has been dominated by the fiasco that is EA Battlefront 2, and for good reason. So where to start on this thing? Well, the loot box thing is probably the biggest grievance, and one I honestly do share. Call me old-fashioned, but loot boxes have never really sat right with me on a basic fundamental level. The ability to indefinitely purchase parts of a game like that always felt slimy, and something I've never personally done. The concept of RNG chests isn't really new, and it works in some other game series. Monster Hunter in particular comes to mind. I know a friend who's really obsessed with that, and I'm kind of getting into it. Even though I admit it took like a year for me to kind of get it. The entire purpose of that series is to repeatedly fight monsters, to then fight Lady Luck, to get monster parts to create better equipment, to tackle even tougher monsters, to do the same thing over and over until you feel like you're done with the game. Or playing it for years like some of my cousins have. One of my cousins spent like 1,000 hours on Monster Hunter 3 for the Wii. That was ridiculous. But I draw the line at paying for a chance to get what you actually want. I do think it's a form of gambling, even though many in charge of deciding that don't feel the same. Since while EA has decided to basically remove microtransactions for the time being in time for this launch day, it's a bit too late for me, really. EA can't undo the damage it's done to a game that I was originally so hopeful for back in January. Cautious optimism turned to hope at E3 before it was slowly whittled away to groaning disappointment that I'm expressing now. And at this point of time, I have seen what I wanted to from the game. 3 nights ago on Tuesday, I saw a playthrough of the game's entire campaign mode. It's the story in EA Battlefront 2 that I was originally most excited to experience, really. My impressions from having seen it early are that it's kind of a best of Star Wars story that tries to act as an episode 6.5, and it basically exists to bridge the gap between episode 6 and 7. It's nothing really spectacular, and its narrative really can't focus on what it wants to be, and even it doesn't even attempt to really be the story it's selling itself on in the marketing trailers for its total runtime. But as a video game, it does the job. It uses everything as an excuse to visit the various planets they made for the game and characters when they want to. And as a Star Wars fan, I did enjoy seeing a few holes in that 3-decade gap being filled, and it was presented nicely enough with some well-acted performances and some characters I did enjoy watching as kind of a pseudo-Star Wars episode. Now, one thing that is glaringly obvious is that the game currently doesn't have a real ending. It just kind of jumps a few decades to depict a neat little lead into Episode 7, but the game itself doesn't really resolve its main character's plot, or story, rather. Because I'm not going in depth here, but I do wonder if the planned December story DLC, if the timing of it has anything to do with Episode 8 itself, to explain why it's kind of conspicuously absent right here at launch, as the game does depict a few things that could be brought up in The Last Jedi next month, but this is all an unresearched gut feeling right now, as I'm avoiding all things Episode 8 that aren't official trailers. I sadly got most of what I wanted out of EA Battlefront 2 in under 2 hours, as I've sat back and watched this entire PR disaster unfold this past week, like probably many of you. I don't envy the developers who poured a lot of blood and sweat into modeling and making the game look as good as it does, and play okay is kind of what it looked like from the playthrough I watched. There's a lot of work on display that is being kind of rightfully overshadowed, as bad as that sounds, by terrible big business practices. It's okay to be angry at Electronic Arts for this, but death threats to developers who likely have nothing to do with the business decisions in question, that's really not okay and makes all of us gamers look really bad, so please don't do that if you have. Try to be civil, please. That being said, I don't know how much input the developer itself has in a project like Star Wars, where the story now has to go through and get approved by a story group for correct continuity now, and how much creative mandates Disney has over the property in general. They didn't seem to really care about a game being marketed for all ages, children included, having loot boxes in it. And now that the game is being investigated to determine if loot boxes can be considered gambling in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, it's actually quite interesting. This is a big deal, as I do believe that regulation was inevitable if this kept up, and it seems that EA tested the limits a bit too well, as we may be dealing with something that can determine the future of this deplorable system. EA claims it's not gambling, but they didn't really put forth any compelling defense in my eyes. Loot boxes are a risky action in the hope of a desired result, which is the very definition of gambling. Heck, even Pokemon got rid of their slot machines in more recent games and remakes for the game corners that they have, because that could be misconstrued as promoting gambling for minors, a large part of Pokemon's player base. And while I kind of miss all the little stupid slot machines like to get Porygon, which, to be fair, was still in the Virtual Console of Red and Blue, I get why they did it. Gone are the days when you can just get a Star Wars game that was technologically impressive for its time and enjoy a polished experience all for one singular price. While Rogue Squadron 2 may be on the short side of content nowadays when compared to what even EA Battlefront 2 has on offer right now, you have to evaluate the experiences they were both aiming for. Rogue Leader was a launch title for the Nintendo GameCube and was one of the most critically acclaimed games on the system, and is still a technological masterclass when you remember this game came out 16 years ago. November 2001 had a ton of impressive looking games, including Metal Gear Solid 2, Dead or Alive 3, and Luigi's Mansion, to name kind of the bigger exclusives that month, and Rogue Squadron 2 was definitely among them. It aimed to be a top-notch arcade-style flight shooter, and with a good amount of replayability in the form of medals that unlocked various bonus levels and other ships, it's one of my favorite Star Wars games. Partially because of nostalgia, as I obviously brought out the GameCube for this very footage, as rusty as I am. The whole Death Star run, I had this terrible lag going on. I didn't calibrate it properly, so that's why it looks like I'm pretty terrible, so apologies for that. On the other hand, though, EA Battlefront 2 is an online multiplayer-focused shooter, and while I cannot really comment on how well it accomplishes that goal, it's undeniably mired under the controversy of loot boxes and shady, grindy gameplay systems designed to test a player's willpower. In a pay-to-win system that it has been, at the time of launch, removed from the game for a short while, according to EA, the game immediately lost its footing before it even took its first step to me. Add to that the rebalancing of ridiculous in-game prices to unlock iconic mainstays such as Luke Skywalker and Darth freaking Vader, the game quickly snowballed into an uproar of outraged gamers that couldn't be ignored by EA at all. While the single-player campaign is a step in the right direction, it currently doesn't have an ending, really, and isn't worth the price of admission alone to me. Galactic Conquest, please. Because I want to like EA Battlefront 2, but I can't quite bring myself to. I do make the difference and effort to distinguish the EA games from the original games because so much of Electronic Arts' fingerprints are all over both games in various ways. From the Season Pass and the air quotes first game to the loot box fiasco of the sequel, what should have been great games and just easy games to make are constantly shackled by unfriendly consumer BS that I can't in good conscience support, even if they're holding one of my favorite franchises hostage. Even more reason to kind of stand my ground, actually. Because if EA truly wanted to fix the problems the game has, they could very easily gain goodwill just by doing a few things. Simply remove all the loot boxes from the game entirely and actually change the reward system so that you can reward characters and costumes and weapons all through in-game play, and not the current system they have where it takes hours upon hours to unlock things like Luke and Darth Vader. Those characters, I'm not against earning them in-game, but at where they were and at kind of where they are now, it's ridiculous that they're even locked through that much to begin with. Like, you should unlock the main character after beating the campaign mode. Like, it should be that simple. But instead they give you enough credits to unlock her, which is kind of a mental manipulation to say, oh, you could get this character, but you also now have enough credits to open a loot box, so it's still kind of shady. The whole games are expensive to make argument is kind of getting old when you consider the problems with that assessment, but I won't dive into that too much in an effort to wrap this video up. Because yes, big budget AAA games have remained a static $60 for around a decade now, but many don't simply cost $60 anymore. DLC, season passes, microtransactions, amiibo, loot boxes, sponsorship deals, the list goes on various ways that it costs a developer to make a game or to promote a game now. And rarely any game nowadays costs a singular price. Heck, even Nintendo, my go-to favorite developers, have games that now have DLC, season passes, and the aforementioned amiibo that unlocks content in-game. While that's a conversation really kind of for another video, Nintendo still largely puts out great games, most of them single-player focused, and the majority of them do not try to nickel and dime you for the most part. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has a season pass, and I did put my faith in the Zelda team that they'll deliver, and come next month I'll see if that $20 was worth the trust I placed in them in the first place. Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle was a great experience, but it also has a season pass that I haven't partaken in because other games came out and I enjoyed the heck out of the base game itself. Metroid Samus Returns was an exemplary return to form for myself as a Metroid fan, and that also came with 2 new amiibo alongside working with the previously released Metroid amiibo for unlockable content, which I admit is kind of shady, but I had wanted and gotten all 4 amiibo anyway, so that situation's kind of between a rock and a hard place. I get it, but I also have them, so I don't know, maybe I'm part of the problem there. Sympathies for that situation, but the base game was still excellent. Like, it's kind of, yes, it is kind of sad that the extras that were originally, say, unlockable for free in Zero Mission are no longer, but again, that's another video. Last month, Super Mario Odyssey was a phenomenal platformer, and possibly one of my favorite Super Mario games ever made. In fact, easily up there with Super Mario Bros. 3 and both Galaxy games. And Odyssey had absolutely no DLC of any kind, while it also had an in-game currency that was used to get costumes that you didn't have to find in a loot box or pay for them at all. It's... how sad is it that I felt the need to point this out? But it's kind of the state of the industry we're in right now. And last but not least, Splatoon 2 also came out over the summer. That is Nintendo's team-based online multiplayer shooter that's still unique from any other shooter out on the market. It's a one-time purchase, and it's being updated weekly with new stages, weapons, and fixes, all free of charge. This encourages players, like its original game, to check back every week, if only for a few minutes or maybe an hour each time just to see what's new. While comparing Splatoon 2 to EA Battlefront 2 would be crazy, and like comparing a grape to a watermelon, I can't help but bring it up and try anyway. I am kind of crazy after all. While it's true that the Star Wars game out today is graphically amazing and obviously took millions of dollars to produce and market, I do have a question to ask. If Nintendo can properly budget their own online game and sell it for $60 only, and update its content for free with a model that it was upfront with about ever since the first game as well, why can't EA Battlefront 2 do the same? Again, a mountain and a molehill are being compared here, but when I look at both games, I see two different intentions. One game is a colorful and charming game that wants to keep you playing for weeks, if not months, as it freely updates on a schedule, in the hopes that you'll pick it up again and just have fun. The other is a fantastically presented licensed game that would be, at the very worst, decent, if that was... but it's intent on forcing its players to deal with a manufactured and unfriendly grind for its content unless they're willing to throw a couple dollars in a way with absolutely no upper limit. I am an optimistic person by default, and I don't mean to sound like I've given up all hope on Star Wars games now that EA has the exclusive rights to ransom the franchise as it sees fit, and in the past 3 years has yet to really top a game from 2005 in terms of content. While there's likely a good game at its core, as a lot of people did like the first Battlefront, regardless of the BS around it, and the original games are obviously loved by many, myself included, it's kind of hard to defend this rebooted duo of games that are as pretty as they are disappointing to me. Because in a world where loot boxes are finally being put to task after a few years of an apathetic section of the industry trying to downplay their significance overall, it's reassuring that I'm not alone in wanting developers that indulge in the practice of paying for RNG drops to reevaluate their outlook on the practice. Excuse me. It's not too much to ask to be treated like a human being instead of whales and dolphins they're transparently fishing for, is it? To be claiming that loot boxes don't affect the game in any way, I'm sorry, but I really think people are fooling themselves when they say that. Because if you could ignore cosmetic-based loot boxes, that's fine. I'm really happy that you can coldly focus on gameplay like that you claim is unaffected by them, and I really wish I could think that way. But I, however, really disagree. In some games like Overwatch, a game I have personally not played, but I have a cousin who loves it to death, he can ignore the loot boxes for the most part, as he basically focuses only on a few characters during limited events, and is fine that all the cosmetic items are on loot boxes, and it doesn't really affect his experience beyond a few intense sessions aiming for a specific drop for a specific character during events. To me, I see a game whose rewards are almost entirely cosmetic, and as such is a big part of the game experience to me. While I agree that on a mechanical level the cosmetics do absolutely nothing to gameplay, the psychological effect it has on players is undeniable here. A certain section of fans are being tempted every time these loot boxes show up. It's a roulette that determines the chance at the reward you may be aiming for, and you don't really have a choice in the matter. Because it's all chance. This is an optimistic view, kind of, from a gamer who sees games as art, for the most part, and doesn't wish them to become soulless, cold systems designed to just solely take out as much money as possible from its consumers. I'm seeing a Star Wars game I want to like, buried under corporate business-minded decisions. To those defending EA's actions, I'm gonna ask you, why? If you don't work for EA on this game, and you don't have any stock in the company, why are you defending a corporation in this case? Because it's not earning enough money that it can from consumers? Like, I get what people say when they're like, oh, they're obviously trying to get money, it's a business. But most of us are gamers in this scenario, and this time enough of us let our grievances be known loud enough that a company had to backpedal enough before launch that they significantly changed a game that was already changed based on the games it was rebooting, kind of. So, at the end of the day, do not mistake this for EA suddenly being repentant. These microtransactions aren't set to be completely removed as of this video, only temporarily disabled at launch. And any action they take to lessen the horrible decisions they made for this game doesn't excuse that it's still less horrible than it already was. It only seems like a sigh of relief because they pushed the envelope so far that any changes for the better is better than nothing, and that shouldn't get a free pass. We already saw their intent. The game is still not free from the mess it finds itself in. It's lessened, but it's not eliminated. And as a Star Wars fan, that makes me sad. As a gamer, I'm disappointed. And as kind of as an optimistic person that tries to look at the glass half full all the time, I'm here to say that it will eventually probably be alright. I can't say how the game will end up in the coming weeks and months, as I don't intend on supporting this title myself, as much as I was looking forward to doing so during that cautiously optimistic E3 2017 presentation earlier this year. But one thing is for certain, those against loot boxes, gamers who care about this medium and want games unfettered by obvious greed-based motives, we have made our voices heard this time. And at least it's put the situation into the media spotlight, and that can only be a good thing in the long run. I want all sorts of people to enjoy a new big-budgeted Star Wars game. Kids, adults, hardcore and casual gamers, everyone deserves to have a blast with a property as big and beloved as Star Wars, especially with a new movie coming out. I can't wait for Episode 8, I hope it's really good. I want someone to be as excited as I was the first time I popped in that mini-disc into my GameCube and lost myself for weeks on end that summer in a galaxy far, far away. And with my optimistic outlook on the situation, that day may eventually come again if we keep up the good fight. So ciao, and I'll see you later.